let me tell you the story of how this national centre came about, or at least the beginnings of the story, because Charlotte will tell the full piece in a moment or two. During lockdown, whilst you were doing pub quizzes and similar, a conversation was struck up between myself in Durham and a bunch of folk in Aberdeen who work in the petroleum industry, but like myself have begun to see that the critical need to change and change quickly, and indeed make the most of that industry in terms of upskilling and repurposing to start to look at geothermal seriously. And we've been trying to do this for a decade or more in the UK, but not really getting the traction. And at some stage in that lockdown conversation on Teams or Zoom, someone said we really need a national centre. And so that's what we've done. And the slides you'll see today are taken from the launch back in June. And so I'll do, if you like, as Joe said, the starter, and then move on to the main course with Charlotte. So Charlotte, if I could have the first slide, please. And just to borrow a little from Charles Dickens, the great author back in the 19th century, if we're talking about annual income of £20 and expenditure 19 and sixpence, the result is happiness. And of course, if the converse is true, that expenditure exceeds income, then the result is misery. And if nothing else, the UK and many other parts of the world have seen some of that misery in recent years, trying to balance in terms of energy, equity, affordability, if you will, sustainability, how long will it last, and of course, and carbon footprint and all that, and security. And it's often depicted in this sort of triangular diagram with the net result that its value is viewed as a zero-sum game. If we improve security, we necessarily cause problems with equity or sustainability or what have you. And what we've been considering for a long time is the value of geothermal energy at all scales and at all systems, from cool to very hot. And so in trying to tell that story in the UK, we put a paper together a few years ago, myself and Charlotte and a bunch of other people, to show where you could use geothermal energy in the UK. I'd like to look in the next slide at a revision of that. So I've coloured in very dark green everywhere in the UK that's suitable for geothermal, and everywhere that's unsuitable for geothermal in that sort of orangey colour. And of course, it's 100%. We can drill and tap geothermal energy anywhere in the UK, just as you can do anywhere in the world. You may find hot rocks shallower in Iceland or Italy than you will in Azerbaijan, but even in Azerbaijan, with 20 kilometers of cold Pliocene sediment resting on older rocks, you still have an increase in thermal gradient. And broadly speaking, although there are areas which are hotter and colder in the UK with depth, you know, if you drill to 1 kilometer, you've got enough heat to bathe in. If you drill to 2 kilometers, you've got enough heat that you can run direct conventional heating systems in Northern Europe from it. And, you know, 3 kilometers, boiling water for a cup of tea or coffee even, and so on. Now, not many people, even within the UK, realise that the first geothermal well, and it's almost accidental, was drilled by Durham University in 1961 in the northeast of England. And it came about because a young geoscientist who'd been studying for a PhD in Cambridge on the gravity anomaly that sits beneath the north of England. And he postulated that there was a granite beneath the sedimentary cover. And as luck would have it, his boss in Durham was very influential as a Director General of what was then the British Geological Survey, and he found the money to drill a well. They got 2 surprises when the well was drilled, and it was drilled successfully. They did indeed prove Martin Bott's hypothesis that there would be a granite at depth, and Martin received became a fellow of the Royal Society on the strength of his work. but it proved to be eroded at the top, and yet it was very hot indeed. So this was a radiogenic granite, still is a radiogenic granite, intruded in Devonian times into older Silurian and Ordovician rocks, and then capped with Carboniferous sediments sometime after it was intruded. And it was hot. And that really was the first well drilled for quite some time in the UK. But if we move on to the next slide, Charlotte, what we've seen of late is the inkling of beginnings of development of geothermal energy in the UK in a very sporadic fashion. Hot rocks drilled in the southwest of England, old coal mines repurposed for heat in the northeast. When we've gone through this, and Charlotte will add some granularity and some numbers to it, but we see a huge number of skilled jobs, including retraining of the 37,000 who are directly employed in the petroleum industry, which is coming to an end in the UK. We see the potential for CO2 reduction by reducing our dependency upon what is now largely imported gas to the UK, with the conditions I'll show in a few minutes' time. We see a huge opportunity for heating the UK, and the paper I mentioned demonstrated quite clearly, even if you simply extracted heat from the ground and didn't put cold water in to be re-warmed, the UK has effectively got a reserves to usage ratio, if going on the amount of heat that's used in the UK sector, in the order of I'm reading your questions, Joe, and I'm going to answer it, but in the order of 100 years. The well was drilled to 1 kilometre depth, and there have been several more drilled. We can now begin to see, possibly before the end of the year, power generated for the first time from a geothermal system in the UK. Charlotte, next slide, please. I want to major on heat, because in the UK, we use about half all of the energy for heating. A little less on the south coast of England and a little more on the north coast of Scotland and the Isles of to the north of northern Scotland, the Shetlands and the Orkneys. And nearly all of that heat is provided by burning gas in people's homes. We have something like 22 million gas boilers. They're extremely efficient, but nonetheless, they of course emit an awful lot of CO2. Although we have all that heat requirement in the UK, currently only 1% is sold as heat. As I say, most is sold as gas. We have oil in our own particular home because we're not on the gas network, and a few people still use coal, and a small number use electricity directly. Electricity, of course, which is generated, at least 50% generated by burning gas in power stations at a very low efficiency for sending power down those power lines. And so we can address the demand for heat and for some cooling now with geothermal systems. Next slide, if I may, please, Charlotte. And that got us thinking about, we really need to make an impact with greenhouse gas reduction in the UK. We've done well with the change in the electricity power system. The last coal-fired power station went off production just a few weeks ago. We balanced between largely gas, then maybe on a very good day that's both windy and sunny, we have 50% each of solar PV and principally offshore wind. But of course, both offshore wind and solar PV are subject to correct weather or sunlight conditions. Geothermal, on the other hand, is great baseload. And given that much of this goes towards heating, we started to think about how we might make a material impact on those greenhouse gas emissions using just a modest array of geothermal systems. And I think that brings us on to the last slide, Charlotte, for me at least. And I've been, as Carlos and others will well know, I spent 28 years in the petroleum industry, before flipping to academia. 28 years of getting carbon out of the ground, and the last 15 trying to shove it back in again. And one of the things which has always interested me, or at least interested me since the mid-90s, and I returned to the UK, was gas supply. At that time, we supplied our own gas. Since then, 2003, we became a net importer. And since becoming a net importer, that has grown to well over 50% of our domestic supply. And this particular chart here, it's slightly disingenuous. It was put together by the UK government to demonstrate, bizarrely, that we should explore our own gas province more thoroughly. And it looks at the carbon footprint associated with transport of methane to the UK. And by far the lowest transport carbon footprint is the single pipeline from Norway. A lot of eggs in that one particular basket. Of course, our own domestic supply has relatively short distance transport through pipelines to the UK, and anything we buy as LNG from Qatar, from the USA, and bizarrely from Peru, has a substantially greater transportation carbon footprint than a domestic supply. And all these are vulnerable. The UK has 1% cover on a cold winter's day like today, -4, between demand and supply. And often industry will get notices that gas cannot be supplied to them if the cold snap continues. So what happens if we think about what we might displace or replace with geothermal, both improving energy security and hitting CO2 footprints? And as you can see from the slide here, we get 2% of our gas from Peru, but actually it contributes massively to the CO2 emissions because of all the transportation, the compression required of that LNG. We could take out 2% very, very easily and knock 3.5 million tons of carbon dioxide off our national inventory very, very rapidly. And these figures, and Charlotte will go to and develop some of the stories, are exactly the sort of targets we're thinking about for the National Centre. And so let's finish by going back to Charles Dickens, if we may, Charlotte. Reduce gas imports by only 2%, we could actually improve energy security substantially, removing those threats from gas supply or gas price hikes, and also reduce national greenhouse gas emissions by something approaching 1%. In the words of Charles Dickens again, annual income £20, annual expenditure 19 and sixpence. We are happy. Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you everybody for the invitation to join you and for coming to listen this afternoon. So I'm Charlotte Adams. I'm the CEO of the newly formed National Geothermal Centre, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the centre and how you can get involved if you wish. So John's already talked a little bit about the surprising and accidental discoveries that were made in terms of geothermal back in the 60s, and since then the UK has had a long geothermal history, from the drilling that went on down in Cornwall in the 1970s, and also the first geothermal scheme, which was developed as part of a drilling programme that was carried out in response to the oil crisis, when the UK turned to look at the potential of its sedimentary basins for geothermal supply. And this one in Southampton, the well was drilled, and embarrassingly enough for us geologists, this was progressed by an accountant rather than a geologist, who actually saw the value in retaining the feature rather than plugging and abandoning the well, and determined back then that it would be used for geothermal energy supply, and it's part of a heat network scheme. The borehole, I think, is just shy of 2 kilometres. The water accessed is around about 70 degrees, and it provides around about a couple of megawatts of heat, as I understand. And then more recent developments, the UK's largest scheme at Gateshead, where the mines beneath the Gateshead town are now used to supply 6 megawatts of heat through a couple of abstraction boreholes that extend 150 metres down into the historic workings beneath the town. And below that is another site that's only a kilometre or so away, where there's 2 large bonded wine warehouses that are kept at optimum temperature by mine water heat. And as John's mentioned, by the end of the year, we've got other exciting developments in Cornwall where geothermal electricity should be produced for the first time. And we've also had some success has been demonstrated by Seraphi at the Kirby Misperton former shale gas site, which they now own and have converted to a geothermal demonstrator. So they have open days, and you can go down and have a look at how they've transformed what was a gas well, or was due to be a shale gas well, how they've repurposed that for geothermal. I went to visit it the other week and it's well worth a look. So we've got a long history of geothermal, but there's quite a lot of stuff going on all over the place, and people have been doing their own things, and a lot of people have done very pioneering work, but we would love to bring that all together just to kind of strengthen the geothermal story across the UK. And so we developed the centre, and John told you a little about how it was formed. It was initially constituted in January this year, but formally launched in the summer. So we've been operating really since we launched since June. So we're formed of some foundation partners that came together initially to establish the centre. So Durham University, through John's efforts, and they got funding from the Rees Foundation, which actually supports my post at the centre. And Durham also provides some in-kind match to that funding. And then the Net Zero Technology Centre in Aberdeen, and they provide obviously a link with a lot of the good work they've been doing up there. And they also second some staff in to the centre and have provided some startup funding to help us get it through our launch and a few of the startup costs and activities that we needed to do. And Shift Geothermal, who are another not-for-profit, and it was Innes at Shift who kind of came up with this concept for a centre in the first place. So we've got him to thank for being here today. And he, their operation is interested in repurposing offshore oil and gas wells for geothermal energy production. So those are our founding partners. I've got another slide in a short while that tells you a little bit more about our board. We have a website, so please do check that out if you want to know more. And what we did, we decided that we would, our mission, we worked out what our mission and vision was for geothermal in the UK. So we really want to supercharge and boost the uptake of geothermal across the UK. We believe now is the time for lots of reasons, some of which John has just alluded to as well, and some of which I can present later. And we want to see geothermal as a consistent option for energy supply, whereas it's fallen in and out of favour over the years. We really believe, because of the things it has to offer and its attributes, as John says, it can be developed more or less anywhere, and it's one of the few low carbon technologies that doesn't suffer from variability of supply. So it can run more or less anytime, anywhere. And what we did, in order to kind of adopt our mission and push it forwards, we decided to set ourselves some targets. So by 2050, we'd like to see 10 gigawatts of heat coming from geothermal. At the moment, it's about 1 gigawatt. And that was based on other countries in Europe who have similar geothermal resources to the UK, who are more advanced with their geothermal development. So principally Germany was used for this example. So their growth in their geothermal sector, if we were to have the same, which theoretically we could because we have a similar resource, we would expect to see 10 gigawatts following the same trajectory that they have by 2050. 1.5 gigawatts of electricity demand. So we currently have zero electricity coming from geothermal. Hopefully, geothermal engineering in Cornwall, that will change very shortly when that comes online. And this was based on previous resource assessments of the UK done by various consultancies who worked out the amount of electricity potentially available from our geothermal. And that would be focusing on the areas where we've got more elevated temperatures, so more likely associated with the granite emplacements that we have across the UK. And also, I think that figure didn't actually take into account any potential that could be generated from offshore oil and gas wells, or onshore oil and gas as well. So there's potential there to maybe do a bit more than that if we include that in it as well. And if we get that amount of geothermal operating by 2050, we could expect to see avoided annual CO2 emissions of 10 million tonnes. And if you work that back into a CCS cost, that's an avoided CCS cost of between 0.8 and 1.2 billion pounds a year. So for developing geothermal at relatively modest costs compared to the savings, and obviously geothermal provides an option where CCS is maybe not an option, so it gives you a low carbon alternative. As John mentioned before, there's potential for job creation, either transition of existing jobs where there's similar skill sets, such as in the oil and gas industry, or, for example, in the mine heat opportunities, those boreholes were drilled by predominantly water well drillers. So there's opportunities for both sectors there. And this is, again, is based on what we've seen elsewhere in the EU. So we would expect to see around about 5 to 10 jobs created per megawatt of geothermal installed. And obviously with that, there's an added benefit of indirect jobs created alongside those direct jobs too. So a little bit about the centre. We're independent, so we're not for profit. We're not currently funded, apart from the startup funding we received from our founders. So at the moment we're searching for funding, but we'd like our funding to be independent. So we would like to operate in a similar way that the Net Zero Technology Centre does. So they are a through funder. They receive government funding, which they then pass on to others. And that's what we'd like to do. So we're identifying areas and gaps that need to be addressed by certain kinds of work. And I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. But we would like to retain that independence where possible in terms of the advice we offer and the sources of funding, and be as independent as possible. We want to work with everybody, so we want to be inclusive. We've done a lot of kind of engagement and talking to people. We've got a contact list of about 500 people now, and that's growing every day. So we're getting across to people that we want to work with them. We want to be collaborative. We realise there's a lot of good work that's already been done, so we definitely don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to build on that and showcase what's been done and help people to get their projects to be visible and get their projects noticed, invested in, and delivered. And we also want to be authoritative, so a lot of people want to know where to go for advice, and there's quite a lot of different sources of information out there. So in its simplest form, we'll probably do a lot of signposting to the information that's there already, and eventually we'd like to develop our own kind of databases, for example, maybe for the types of academic research that are going on geothermal, or for data that are available. So those are the things we'd like to work towards eventually. Here's our board, so they're all on our website. So if you'd like to find a little bit more out about each person, and these are the people that were behind the NGC when it started. And another reason why we need it, so there's a lot of reports that you see on energy that come out, and particularly future energy reports and reports on decarbonisation. I find that when I open them, I do a quick Control F and geothermal doesn't come up. So I think if the NGC could make sure that Control F gives us geothermal, I think we're doing our job. So as well as there not being specific roadmaps and for geothermal, we have got a couple of white papers that have come out, but there hasn't been the kind of commitment to these kind of roadmaps and adopted plans that there has been for other technologies, and there also hasn't been the funding either. So that's why we feel we need an NGC, and we would like to produce a roadmap, which I'll talk about shortly, that can be adopted to help reach those targets that I outlined earlier. So the things that we're doing at the moment, I've mentioned that we're looking for funding. So that might be something like a spending review bid. So we'd like to get an amount of government funding, then we can operate as a through funder and pass that on. We'd also like to apply for any other types of funding that might be available and appropriate to facilitate collaboration between our stakeholders. We're working on a roadmap, as I mentioned. I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And also, I think we need a plan, because if the government suddenly came up with an announcement that here's 40 million for geothermal, what are you going to do with it? I think we would then need to know exactly where we wanted to start and which opportunities we wanted to progress. The other things I think we need to do is, people have asked where projects are happening. So there's investment community asking where are people wanting to do projects so we can think about investing. There's also people looking where to do projects but don't know exactly where the resources are. And there are quite a few resource maps available for where the mines are, or for where the granites are, or for where the sedimentary basins are. There's some fantastic stuff on the British Geological Survey website, but there are still a few gaps in some of that information. So I think there's some gaps to be filled to improve opportunity mapping. We want to look at there's lots of different ways of doing geothermal, often called as different flavours of geothermal for the UK. And we're looking at the different pros and cons of each. So we've just done a workshop on that at a conference last week in London with a group of 50 or so stakeholders from across the geothermal sector. We also need some kind of templates and economic models so people can see what different types of deployments might offer. I mentioned a workshop we've already had. We've got other ones planned, probably through collaboration with others at the moment until we get more funding. We've been talking to Joseph about some of the work that he's been doing, and that kind of engagement and consultation that he's worked on, I think, is an exemplar of something that the centre would love to do as well, because it's delivered such success. We'd also get involved in writing briefings and white papers, recommendations, and responding to consultations. So in terms of the roadmap, we've identified kind of 4 priority areas, and when we're having our conversations with our stakeholders, they all fit into one of these four identified areas. So against those areas, we've plotted certain activities that might take place. So on infrastructure, there's a huge opportunity, for example, for geothermal to be incorporated into heat networks, particularly for delivery of low carbon heat, and there's government funding to support heat network development. Technology and innovation, there's lots of skills, existing skills and innovative products and projects that would allow things like reducing the amount of time that drilling takes, which then reduces your cost because you're spending less time on site and drillers charge per day on site. So things like that, ways of improving the efficiency and lowering the cost of geothermal. Also, on the policy and regulation side, we do have regulation for geothermal. There are schemes that have been regulated, so that there is regulation available. That probably needs to be streamlined a little more to make it a faster and more efficient process for people who are delivering geothermal projects. And also research and knowledge. So that's working with our academic community. We've identified around about 20 universities that are working on geothermal over the UK, and speaking to people from mainland Europe, they're saying that we have a really high concentration of geothermal researchers, more so than over there in some cases, which is really good to know. So we want to find out what they're doing, highlight what they're doing, see what projects they're doing, work with industry to say what industry would like to do, and could academia help to work on that. So lots of kind of research and industry collaborations. And then we've got some of our outcomes on the right-hand side. And what we plan to do is in the spring, these will be written out into a fuller report. If anybody's interested in geothermal roadmap, Germany have produced one, which is really good. So we're certainly looking at that. And also France and Hungary and the Netherlands have produced them as well. So we've been looking at what's been done already. Are there common things that people are asking for, and what can we use from that? So I've mentioned there's other nations that have similar geology to the UK, and the targets they want to achieve do align quite well with the targets that we've set out. So we've got some confidence that those figures we put forward are achievable. Some of their success has been driven by support measures that we don't have in the UK. So there's generally 3 things that made geothermal work in these other countries. That's access to data. There's also risk insurance schemes for drilling, and also a feed-in tariff so that you get paid for the energy you're producing as you produce it from your geothermal well. In the UK, we have access to data, but that can be a bit piecemeal. It can be costly. There might not be data available for some areas, particularly if it's not been explored for oil and gas previously. We don't have a state-backed risk insurance scheme for drilling. And we used to have the renewable heat incentive, which allowed you to get payments for heat produced, but that scheme has stopped now. So the Gateshead heat scheme got it, but that was one of the last to get it. We do have contracts for difference for electricity production, but as John's mentioned, most UK geothermal will be heat. And we also have the Green Heat Network Fund, which helps to fund heat networks. And geothermal can be incorporated as part of that. Because of the drilling costs, though, it can be difficult sometimes to make that stack up, because it's all based on a price that you will end up with for the heat you're supplying. If we can do things, though, like add cooling and also add storage to our geothermal projects, then you're adding value to that project, and that can be a game changer. And there's a lot of research being going on onto storage and using geothermal for heating and cooling. So that's going to be really important, I think, going forwards. And in the meantime, until we get maybe some more support measures in place, there's other things we can do. So, for example, we could drill a borehole at a site and learn from doing that. If what we find when we drill is promising, we could put another borehole in and form a doublet, which is generally the most efficient way to access geothermal. So you've got a borehole to take the water out of, recover the heat from the water at surface, and then return it to the subsurface through the other borehole. If the geology doesn't look promising and you've not got the fluid flows you want, but you'll have the temperatures you want, because we know how hot it gets with depth, we just don't know what the fluid flow situation is like at depth. If you don't get what you want, you could complete that as a single well borehole, where you've got a pipe-in-pipe type situation, and the water is circulated through that, and that scavenges heat from the ground. And the downside of that is obviously there's less heat recovered, so you're talking of a few hundred kilowatts, whereas with a doublet you're talking of maybe up to 10, 20 megawatts, something like that. But that's a good way to de-risk geothermal in the meantime until we have more support measures in place. So to build it out gradually, increasing your risk profile as you go. And as I mentioned before, there are things we can do to improve the economics of geothermal. So combining projects, so you might have a housing scheme, and the water that's used to heat the housing scheme, as it leaves the housing scheme, would still have enough heating, for example, to be used in a glass house. So a kind of cascade of use of the hot water is one way. Heating, cooling and storage I've mentioned. Recovering other resources, so there's interest in the electricity generation sites down in Cornwall. Geothermal engineering are looking at also recovering lithium from the water that they will bring to surface to produce electricity and heat. And there's also potential for high-grade energy users to give their heat to the subsurface. So there's no reason why you couldn't get a glassworks and put some of their waste heat back underground. So you could actually raise the temperature of your reservoir underground higher than it is from the natural geothermal gradient, meaning that you can access it at a shallower depth, but it's a higher temperature than you might expect. And I've been, with the various announcements that have come out on CCS and hydrogen recently, I've been thinking about other ways to frame geothermal and to talk about geothermal. As I've mentioned already, it can be used where CCS is not an option. So you might have some industrial clusters which use a lot of heat for their processes, but they're not near to a site where CCS injection is possible. But switching their heat supply to geothermal would remove some carbon emissions from that. As John mentioned at the very start of the talk, we have the potential to easily offset some of the most carbon intensive LNG that we import by using geothermal. There's potential for waste heat storage when we've got things like wind turbines, which are curtailed when there's an overproduction of electricity. That could be stored as heat in the subsurface, and there's some really good research projects going on in UK universities on that presently. There's also good potential to integrate with other renewable energy sources. So, for example, at Gateshead, they have a solar photovoltaic farm, and in the summer, when the demand for heat is low and the heat network is running a hot water demand, the electricity produced from their solar farm is enough to run the heat pumps, which makes their scheme carbon zero, which is a real achievement. We don't need rare or critical minerals for geothermal, as we may do for some other technologies. And in some cases, geothermal fluids, as I've already mentioned, can be a source of critical minerals, especially if you can access things such as lithium. And we've heard about, there's been an announcement about Great British Energy, which will focus in the first instance, we understand, on electricity, and its aim is, as is the government's aim, to produce clean electricity by 2030. And it's sometimes hard to see where geothermal can fit into that, but by switching people onto geothermal and using heat pumps, that's more efficient than burning gas, and also using gas to produce electricity to heat homes. So there's an opportunity for geothermal to be used in the right places for grid balancing as we decarbonise the grid. So I'd love to discuss working together. As a centre, we would love to have hubs of regional expertise. And in Northern Ireland, we see that the engagement and awareness work that Joe and some of his colleagues have been doing, it's, you know, that awareness raising and has had tangible actions that are now being delivered, and with the drilling that's going on. And I won't say too much more because I know Michael McKenzie will be the next speaker next month, but it'd be lovely to have a centre of excellence based around that knowledge of that engagement and awareness that has been really pioneered in Northern Ireland. And we'd love an opportunity to have a hub there, and we'd like to have others across the UK as part of, you know, building on those specific areas of knowledge. So we're very keen to work with you and happy to take questions, and thank you very much for listening.